The rain tapped softly against the awning of the small bakery on Maple Street, and Cooper stopped again. He sat down on the yellow curb, ears low, tail still, and would not move. Thomas Bennett wiped the wet from his cheeks and did not tug the leash. His voice cracked once, low and quiet, and he said, "Take your time, buddy. Take all the time you need." A woman across the street covered her mouth. She had watched them for months and never understood. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments what part of the world you are listening from, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this one. Thomas could not see the woman across the street. He had not seen a face clearly in almost 4 years. The world for him had become a soft blur of moving shapes, grey light and warm colours, and he had learned to read the rest, with his ears and his hands, and with the steady tug of a leash that always knew where to go. But Cooper, the old golden retriever leaning against his knee, had not tugged him in a long time. Cooper was 15 now, silver around the mouth, slower on the stairs, gentler with his eyes. And every single morning, rain or sun, on the walk back from the little bakery on the corner of Maple and 2nd, Cooper stopped at the same yellow curb, sat down, and refused to move for exactly 3 long breaths. Thomas counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. Then Cooper would rise, nudge his knee, and lead him across as if nothing had happened. For 7 years he had done this. For 7 years Thomas had never asked him why. He thought he already knew. 7 years earlier, on that same crosswalk in the town of Millbrook, Ohio, on a bright afternoon in late spring, Thomas had lost the person who had raised Cooper from a puppy no bigger than a loaf of bread. Her name was Nora, and she had been 48 years old, and she had been walking Cooper home from a checkup at the vet on Franklin Street. She had a small paper bag in her hand with a bottle of eardrops in it, and she was wearing the blue sweater Thomas had given her for their 20th wedding anniversary. Thomas had been standing on the other side of the road, in front of the same bakery that still stood there today, holding 2 cups of black coffee, waiting for her. He had lifted one of the cups a little in the air so she would see him. She had smiled and started to step off the curb. He did not remember the sound of the truck. He remembered the sound after the truck, which was worse. He remembered the coffee spilling on his shoes, warm and wrong, and he remembered running so hard he thought his heart would burst out through his shirt. And he remembered that when he reached her, Cooper was already there, lying pressed against her side, whining a soft, high, unfamiliar sound, and licking her hand as if he could wake her up if he just tried a little harder. Cooper's leash was still wrapped around her wrist. He had not let go of her. He had not let go of her for anything in the world. Thomas did not remember most of the 2 months that came after. What he did remember was a small yellow note that arrived in the mail one afternoon 6 weeks later. It came in a white envelope with no return address. It said, in his wife's careful handwriting, "If you are reading this, I already made sure someone would walk you home. His name is Cooper. He is a very good boy. Please don't blame him for anything." That was all. Thomas had read the note 11 times, sitting alone at the kitchen table, and then he had folded it and put it inside the copy of the book she had been reading, on the page where she had stopped, and he had never taken it out again. He'd never learned when she had written it. He never learned how she had known to write it. He had a guess. 2 years before the accident, a specialist in Cleveland had looked into Thomas's eyes with a bright light and told him, with the kind of even voice doctors use when they are trying to be kind and honest at the same time, that a rare condition in his retinas was going to take his sight, slowly, over the course of the next 10 to 15 years. There was nothing to do about it. There was no surgery, no drops, no diet. There was only time. Thomas had walked out of that office and driven home with his hands shaking on the steering wheel. And when he told Nora that night, she had cried once, quickly, in the bathroom. And then she had come out and made him grilled cheese sandwiches and told him they would figure it out. 2 weeks later, She'd come home with a fat, sleepy puppy in a cardboard box and set him on the kitchen floor. She had said, "This is Cooper. He's going to grow up smart. You'll see." Thomas had laughed and rubbed the puppy's ears. He had thought she meant it as a comfort, a distraction, a friend for the long walk down. He had not understood then that she had already begun training the dog to be his eyes. Cooper learned everything. Cooper learned to sit at every curb and count the seconds. Cooper learned to nudge Thomas's left knee before turning left and his right knee before turning right. Cooper learned the difference between a dropped fork and a dropped pill bottle by the sound they made on the tile. Cooper learned to bring the phone when the phone rang, and to bring the leash when the door opened, and to lie across the top of the stairs whenever it was dark, so that if Thomas tried to walk down without his cane, Cooper's soft, warm body would stop him. Nora had done all of it herself. She had read 3 books about it. She had taken Cooper to 2 seminars 2 hours away in a town Thomas had never been to, and she had never once told Thomas in words that this was what she was doing. She had only said again and again, "He is going to grow up smart. You'll see." Then she was gone, and the dog she had trained walked Thomas home. For a long time, Thomas thought he understood the yellow curb. He thought Cooper stopped there because Cooper remembered the smell of gasoline, the shouting, the moment he had lain down beside a woman who did not get up. He thought a dog's memory could hold a thing like that for 7 whole years without ever forgetting the exact spot. And he thought that if Cooper needed 3 breaths at that curb every morning, then Cooper could have 3 breaths and 30 and 300 because Thomas had loved that woman too, and he had all the breaths in the world to give. But he was wrong. He did not know it yet, but he was wrong about the reason. And when he finally learned the truth, it would break him open like a stone that has been waiting to crack for 7 years, and out of that crack would come a light he had thought was gone forever. It started with a young reporter, her name was Emma Caldwell, and she was 26 years old, and she worked for a small local paper called the Millbrook Sentinel that most people picked up for the crossword and the school lunch menus. She was tall and thin, with red hair she tied up in the mornings, and she wrote a weekly column called Around the Corner that no one important read. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above the pharmacy, and she was thinking about quitting the paper and moving to Columbus, because her boss kept telling her that human interest stories did not sell and that she needed to cover more council meetings. She had been thinking about quitting for 3 months. Emma had noticed the old man and the old dog because she walked past the same bakery on her way to work every morning at 6:45, and she had noticed them the way you notice a tree that always has a bird in it. Then, one Tuesday, she stopped and watched them from the doorway of the flower shop, and she counted. She counted the 3 breaths at the yellow curb. She counted them again the next day. And on the 3rd day, she followed them all the way home, walking on the far side of the street with her coffee in her hand and her notebook in her coat pocket, and she promised herself she would ask. She caught up with them on Elm Street, half a block from Thomas's little blue house. She apologized twice for being intrusive. She said her name and where she worked. Thomas listened with his head tilted slightly the way blind people do when they are trying to place a voice on a face. He said, "Well, Miss Caldwell, I'm afraid there isn't much of a story. My dog is old and I am older, and we have our habits." Emma laughed softly because his voice was warm and slow, and she said, "Sir, can I just ask why he stops at that corner every morning?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You'd better come in for coffee. It's a longer answer than the sidewalk deserves." They sat at his kitchen table for an hour and a half. Cooper lay under Thomas's chair with his chin on the man's slipper. Thomas told Emma about Nora and about the sweater and about the 2 cups of coffee and about the note in the book on the shelf. He told her about the diagnosis. He told her, in a voice so quiet she had to lean forward, that he did not know for certain why Cooper stopped at the curb, but he believed the dog was still walking his wife home. He said it exactly like that. I think he's still walking her home." Emma did not cry until she was back in her apartment. Then she cried for 20 minutes with her jacket still on, and then she opened her laptop and wrote for 4 straight hours without getting up once. She turned in the piece to her editor at 11 o'clock that night. Her editor read it twice. He said, "Emma, this is the best thing you have ever written. Get out of my office before I have to hug you." The story ran on the front page of the Little Millbrook Sentinel the following Sunday, with a photograph Emma had taken from across the street of a grey-haired man in a brown coat and a golden dog sitting on a yellow curb in the rain. The headline was simple. It said, "The dog who still walks her home." That should have been the end of it. It was not. By Monday afternoon, a woman in Columbus who worked at a bigger paper had picked up the story and shared it. By Tuesday morning, it was in a paper in Cleveland. By Wednesday, a national morning show had called Emma's editor and asked if they could have permission to reprint the photograph and read the article on the air. By Thursday, Thomas's phone was ringing so often that Cooper had learned to bring it to him every 3 minutes, panting a little from the effort, and Thomas had finally unplugged it from the wall. On Friday, a stranger from Oregon sent a card in the mail that said only, "Thank you. My grandfather is going blind. I am going to visit him this weekend." Thomas held that card in his hands for a long time. He read it 3 times, running his fingertips over the letters, because he could still make out large print if he squinted. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and cried a little into a dish towel while Cooper leaned against his leg and did not move. On Saturday morning, someone knocked on his front door. Thomas heard Cooper stand up. He heard the soft click of the dog's nails on the wood floor as Cooper walked to the door and stopped in front of it and sat down. Cooper did not bark. Cooper had not barked at a stranger in more than 10 years. But he did sit at the door, which was his way of saying that someone was there and Thomas should come. Thomas walked slowly with his cane. He opened the door and asked gently, "Yes? Who is it?" A woman's voice, very small, said, "Mr. Bennett." He said, "Yes." She said, "My name is Sarah Whitaker. I was driving the truck." He did not answer at first. His hand tightened on the doorframe. Cooper, sitting at his feet, made a soft sound that was not a whine and not a bark, only a kind of held breath. Sarah stood on the porch in a grey raincoat that was too big for her, holding a folded paper bag in one hand and something long and wrapped in a blanket in the other. Her hair was streaked with early grey, and she looked older than she was, and her eyes were red the way eyes get when you have cried yourself out of tears and then tried to cry again anyway. Thomas said, "You'd better come inside." They sat at the same kitchen table where he had sat with Emma. Sarah refused coffee. She said, without any preamble, because she had been rehearsing the words for 7 years, "It was my fault. I ran that light. I looked at my phone for 2 seconds and I ran that light. I was 23 years old and I had been driving that route for 3 months, and I was trying to make a delivery on time because my supervisor told me if I was late one more day, he would fire me, and I could not afford to lose that job. My little sister was sick. My mother was working 2 jobs already. I did the wrong thing and I killed a good person, and I have not slept a whole night since." She stopped. She swallowed. She said, "I am not here to ask you to forgive me. I know that isn't mine to ask for. I am here because I read the article and I read it 4 times, and I couldn't be a coward for 1 more day." Thomas listened without moving. Cooper had come and lain down across his feet. Thomas could feel the dog's warm weight on his ankles, and he could hear Sarah's breathing catching in her throat, and he could smell the wet rain on her coat and the coffee still on the counter. And he thought about how strange it was that he had known this woman existed for 7 years, had thought about her many times, had imagined her 100 different ways, and yet had never once pictured her sitting at his kitchen table with her hands shaking on the tablecloth. He said quietly, "What is in the blanket?" Sarah looked down. She said, "I picked it up from the street. Afterwards, I could not leave it there. I have kept it in a drawer for 7 years. I did not know what to do with it." She unfolded the blanket. Inside was a small paper bag that had once been white and was now a soft brownish yellow, the color paper goes when you have looked at it too many times. She set it on the table with both hands, the way you set down something that could break. Thomas reached out and touched it. His fingers knew it at once. It was the bag from the vet on Franklin Street. It was the bag Nora had been carrying home. The bottle of eardrops for Cooper was still inside it, sealed and untouched, the label yellowed and curled at the corners. Thomas did not say anything for a long time. He held the bag in both hands and pressed it very gently against his forehead. Cooper, on the floor, whined once, low. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand and did not let herself make a sound. At last, Thomas said, "Thank you." Sarah blinked. "Thank you?" "For carrying it for 7 years," he said. "I know how heavy paper can get." Sarah made a sound that was half sob and half laugh, and she put her face down in her arms on the table and shook for a long time. Cooper got up from Thomas's feet and walked over and pushed his grey muzzle against her elbow, gently, the way he did when children in the park cried. Sarah lifted her head and stared at him. Cooper licked her wrist once. Then he laid his chin on her knee and closed his eyes. Sarah whispered, "He should hate me." Thomas said, "He was raised by a woman who did not hate anybody. I don't think he knows how." They talked for 2 more hours. Sarah told him that she had been to therapy, on and off, for 6 years, and that her sister had recovered and was in college now and did not know what had happened, and that Sarah had gotten a different job at a warehouse and had worked her way up to floor manager and had never driven a truck again. She told him that her mother had passed away 4 years ago and that Sarah had held her mother's hand in the hospital and had almost told her about the accident and had not. Thomas listened. He nodded. He did not interrupt. At the end, Sarah stood up to leave. She stopped at the door. She said, "I would like to do something if you will let me. I don't know what would be right, but I have been saving for 7 years. And I would like to put something at that corner. A bench, maybe, where he stops. A place for people to sit with a plaque, something small, nothing that draws attention to what happened. Just a place, if you will allow it." Thomas felt Cooper's warm breath against his shin. He said, "What would the plaque say?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I thought it might say, 'For those who wait.'" Thomas closed his eyes. He said, "Yes, that would be right." That should have been the end of it too. It was not. On Monday morning, Cooper stopped at the yellow curb, sat down for 3 breaths, and this time on the 3rd breath, he laid himself down flat on the cold, wet sidewalk and did not get up. Thomas felt the leash go slack, then heavy in a strange way, and he stopped. He said Cooper's name. He said, "Come on, buddy, come on now, let's go home." Cooper did not move. Thomas knelt down on the concrete, and his knee hit the wet cement with a bright small pain, and he put both his hands into the fur along Cooper's ribs. Cooper's breathing was too fast. His nose was warm. He tried to lift his head to meet Thomas's face and could not. Thomas said, in a voice that did not sound like his own, "Oh, no! Oh, buddy, please!" A man from across the street came running. It was the baker, a big red-faced man named Frank, who had known Thomas for 20 years and had watched Cooper stop at that curb every morning for 7. Frank scooped Cooper up in his flour-dusted arms and carried the dog to his van, and he drove Thomas and Cooper to the vet on Franklin Street, the same vet Nora had been walking home from on the day the truck came. The road was wet, and the tires hissed on the pavement, and Thomas sat in the passenger seat with Cooper's head in his lap and his hand on Cooper's warm ribs, and he counted the breaths. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, over and over. The vet was a small woman with quick hands. She was Nora's age when Nora had died, though of course Thomas did not know that anymore because he had not seen a face clearly in years. She took Cooper into the back, and Thomas sat in the little waiting room with the smell of pine cleaner and dog treats and a soft ticking clock, and he did not cry because he did not have room in his chest for it yet. Frank sat beside him and did not say anything and did not leave. After 35 minutes, the vet came back. She sat down across from Thomas and she took his hand in both of hers. She said, "Mr. Bennett, his heart is not doing well. He is not in pain right now, but it will not be very long. Days, maybe a week, maybe less." Thomas said, "Can I take him home?" She said, "Yes, that is exactly what he would want." Frank drove them home. Cooper slept in Thomas's lap in the front seat. Thomas kept his hand on Cooper's chest and could feel the slow, tired thud of the old heart. And he thought about the yellow curb, and about the 3 breaths, and about the note in the book, and about the paper bag on the kitchen table with the bottle of eardrops still sealed inside it. And he thought for the first time in 7 years that maybe he had been wrong about the corner. Maybe Cooper was not remembering pain. Maybe Cooper was not remembering anything at all. Maybe Cooper was waiting, but waiting for what? That afternoon, Emma came by the house. She had heard from Frank because in a town like Millbrook, everyone heard from Frank. She sat on the floor of Thomas's living room in her jeans with Cooper's head in her lap, and she stroked the dog's long silver ears, and she cried without hiding it. And Thomas sat in his chair beside them and did not try to comfort her because he understood that some grief you have to let happen. After a while, Emma said, "Mr. Bennett, may I ask you something?" He said, "Yes." She said, "The bench, Sarah's bench, it is being made. She has already ordered it. She showed me the design. It will be ready by the end of the week." Thomas said, "That is good." Emma said, "If it comes in time, would you like to be there when it is set in the sidewalk?" Thomas ran his hand over Cooper's back, slow and light. He said, "Yes, I would like that very much, and I would like Cooper to be there." Emma said quietly, "Then let's make sure he is." She made phone calls that night. Sarah made phone calls the next morning. The town office moved a permit that would normally have taken 2 weeks and moved it in 1 day. The concrete workers moved a job that had been scheduled for the following Monday to the coming Saturday. The bench was already finished, sitting in the back of a small metalworking shop in a town called Redfield, an hour away, and the man who had welded it drove it into Millbrook himself in the bed of his pickup truck on Friday afternoon. He would not take payment. He said his father had gone blind in 1997 and had a Labrador named Bear, and that Bear had walked his father to church every Sunday for 11 years, and that if a bench like this had been set in a sidewalk for Bear, his father would have sat on it and wept, and he was not going to take $1 for it. That was Friday. On Friday night, Cooper stopped eating. He would drink water if Thomas held the bowl. He would lift his head if Thomas said his name, but he would not eat. Thomas sat on the kitchen floor with the old dog stretched out beside him, and he laid a folded blanket under Cooper's head, and he stroked the top of Cooper's skull, gently, gently, in the way Nora had always stroked him. He talked to the dog. He told the dog about the note in the book. He told the dog he was sorry it had taken him 7 years to understand what the dog was doing at that curb. He said, "I am not sure I understand even now, but I think I am close. I think maybe, buddy, you are close too." Cooper's tail thumped once against the tile. It was a very quiet sound. That was the last thing Thomas heard before he fell asleep on the kitchen floor with his hand still resting on Cooper's warm side. He woke up at 4 in the morning to Cooper licking his face, once, twice, 3 times. Cooper's eyes were open and clear. Cooper stood up on shaky legs and looked at Thomas with the same look he had given him for 15 years. Thomas sat up, his back sore, and he said, "Cooper?" Cooper walked to the front door. He sat down. He looked back over his shoulder. Thomas got up. He put on his shoes. He clipped the leash to Cooper's collar. He opened the door. Outside, the world was still dark and quiet and smelled of wet leaves. There was no rain. There was almost no sound. Somewhere very far away, a train was blowing its whistle, low and lonely. Thomas took the leash in his hand. He said, "Where do you want to go, buddy?" Cooper began to walk. He walked slowly, so slowly that Thomas had to remind himself not to hurry him, and he took Thomas down Elm Street toward 2nd and down 2nd toward Maple, and Thomas knew where they were going before they got there. They stopped at the yellow curb. Cooper sat down. He counted his 3 breaths, the way he had counted them every day for 7 years. Then, instead of standing up and nudging Thomas's knee and crossing the street, Cooper turned his old head and looked up at Thomas and made a small, soft sound in his throat, the kind of sound a dog makes when it is trying very hard to say something for which there are no words. Thomas felt the sound in his own chest. He knelt down on the wet sidewalk. He put his forehead against Cooper's forehead. He said, "What is it, buddy? What is it? What do you want me to see?" And Cooper, very slowly, turned his head and looked at the corner of the sidewalk near the base of the streetlight, where the concrete had cracked years ago and a small patch of grass had grown up through it. Thomas could not see the grass, but he reached out. His fingers found the crack. His fingers found something else, something small and hard, wedged deep into the crack, half buried under 7 years of dirt and rain. He pulled it out. He turned it over in his palm. It was a silver ring. It was a woman's ring. It was thin and simple, with a very small blue stone. It was Nora's engagement ring. Thomas held it in his palm and could not breathe. He could not remember at first whether Nora had been wearing this ring on the day of the accident. He remembered her wedding band, plain gold, always on her finger, but the engagement ring, the little silver one with the blue stone, she had taken off 2 years earlier because her knuckles had swollen with a small arthritis that had come with her age. She had kept the ring in a small ceramic dish on the kitchen windowsill. Thomas had not thought of the ring in 7 years. He had assumed it was still in that dish. He held the ring against his face. It smelled of nothing. It was cold. It was small. It was hers. He said, "How did you know, buddy? How did you know it was here?" Cooper's tail thumped once against the sidewalk. It was a very quiet sound. Thomas sat down on the curb with the ring in his palm and the dog against his side, and he understood then, for the first time in 7 whole years, exactly what Cooper had been doing at that corner. Cooper had not been remembering the truck. Cooper had not been standing guard over the place where Nora had fallen. Cooper had been standing over the place where a small silver ring had rolled out of Nora's pocket, or off her finger, or out of the little paper bag on the day of the accident, and had slipped down into a crack in the concrete where no human eye would ever have found it, and where a dog's nose had known it was there all along. Cooper had not been keeping a memory. Cooper had been keeping a promise. He had known, in the way dogs know things, that the small piece of the woman who had raised him from a puppy was still in that place, and he had refused, for 7 years, to leave it unattended. He had come every single morning, sat for exactly 3 breaths, and made sure it was still there. And now, at the end of his own days, he had brought Thomas back to find it. Thomas put the ring on his little finger because it would not fit anywhere else. He got to his feet. Cooper got to his feet beside him. Thomas said, "Let's go home, buddy. It is time to go home." They crossed the street together, slowly, calmly, and this time on the far side, Cooper did not look back. By the time they reached Thomas's little blue house, the sky was pink at the eastern edge, and the birds had begun to say small, quick things to each other from the wet trees. And Cooper had begun to walk very slowly indeed. Thomas opened the front door. He guided Cooper to the folded blanket in the kitchen. Cooper lay down. He put his chin on his paws. He looked up at Thomas with tired, kind eyes. Thomas sat down beside him on the floor. He put one hand on Cooper's chest so he could feel the heart. He said, "Not yet, buddy, not yet. One more day for the bench. Nora would want you to see the bench." Cooper's tail thumped once against the tile. It was a very, very quiet sound. He did not die that morning. He slept most of the day. He drank a little water at noon. In the late afternoon, he ate 3 small pieces of chicken from Thomas's hand. And Thomas laughed once, a short, unbelieving laugh, and said, "You are a stubborn old man. I love you for it." Cooper wagged his tail 2 times. Saturday morning came. The sky was clear, the first real sunny Saturday of November after 2 weeks of rain. Word had travelled through Millbrook the way word travels in a town of 8,000 people who all know each other's dogs. By 9 in the morning, a small crowd had begun to gather at the corner of Maple and 2nd. By 10, it was not a small crowd anymore. Frank the baker had brought out a folding table and put warm sweet rolls on it for anyone who wanted one. Emma was there in a green scarf, taking pictures with her phone, though she was crying too much to hold it steady. Sarah was there in the same grey raincoat, standing at the very edge of the sidewalk, her hands shoved deep in her pockets, looking as if she might faint and as if she might fly. The concrete workers had set the bench in place at first light. It was a simple wooden bench with wrought iron sides. On the seat at the very centre there was a small brass plaque. It read only, "For those who wait." At 10:15, Thomas came down Elm Street with Cooper walking very slowly beside him. Frank went to meet them. Frank put one arm gently around Thomas's shoulders and did not offer to carry Cooper because Cooper was walking on his own 4 legs, and Frank understood, without being told, that this mattered. The crowd parted. Nobody clapped. Nobody said anything at all. They only stood quietly and watched an old man and an old dog walk the last 100 yards of a 7-year journey. Thomas stopped when he reached the yellow curb. Cooper stopped beside him. Cooper sat down. He took his 3 breaths. Then he stood up, walked the 2 extra steps to the new wooden bench, and lay down on the sidewalk beside it, resting his grey muzzle on his paws. Thomas sat down on the bench. He put one hand on the wooden slats, warm now from the November sun. He put the other hand down on Cooper's warm side, where he could feel the slow, tired thud of the old heart. He tipped his face up to the sunlight and closed his eyes, and he let it warm the wet on his cheeks, and he could smell the rolls from Frank's table, and the coffee that someone had brought, and the wet pavement, and the faint, sharp sweetness of the small potted mums that a neighbour had set at the base of the bench that morning without telling anyone. Sarah came over. She sat down on the far end of the bench, leaving a careful, respectful gap. She did not say anything for a long time. Then, in a voice so quiet that only Thomas heard, she said, "Mr. Bennett, I did not deserve to sit down here today. I know that." Thomas turned his face toward her voice. He said, "Sarah, do you know why the bench is here?" She said, "Because of your wife." He said, "No, the bench is here because of you, because you came to my door, because you sat at my kitchen table, because you carried a paper bag for 7 years. Nora would be here on this bench with us if she could be, but she cannot. And what you have done today is the closest thing to bringing her back that anybody in this town could have done. So sit, please, sit." Sarah sat. She did not move. She did not speak. Tears ran down her face steadily and quietly, and she did not wipe them, because they were not the same tears she had cried for 7 years. Emma came over. She knelt in front of the bench and put one hand on Cooper's shoulder. She said, "Mr. Bennett, I want to tell you something." Thomas said, "Yes?" Emma said, "That story I wrote. My editor is running it again next week as a follow-up. About the bench, about Miss Whittaker, about all of this. But I wanted you to know before it runs that I got a letter yesterday from a man in a town in Vermont. He read the first article. His name is Mr. Halverson. He is 79 years old. He has a service dog named Ranger. He wrote to tell me that Ranger stops every day at the corner where his late wife used to wait for him after his shifts at the mill. Mr. Halverson never understood why. And after he read our article, he sat on that same corner with Ranger for 2 hours, and Ranger dug up a small silver locket that Mr. Halverson had bought for his wife on their 40th anniversary, that his wife had lost a year before she passed away. Emma paused. She said softly, "Mr. Bennett, there are dogs all over this country waiting for someone to notice." Thomas did not answer. He could not. He only reached out, slowly, and put his hand on top of Emma's hand where it rested on Cooper's shoulder. Cooper opened his eyes. He looked at Emma. He looked at Sarah. He looked at Thomas. He wagged his tail, very slowly, 3 times. Then he laid his head back down on his paws and closed his eyes. He didn't open them again. Thomas felt the moment. He felt the slow, tired heart under his hand, slow one last time, and stop, gently, without struggle, in the November sunlight, on the sidewalk beside a wooden bench, on the corner where he had waited every morning for 7 long years. Thomas did not move his hand. He did not move at all. The crowd in front of him did not know yet. Sarah beside him did not know yet. Emma, at his knees, felt it first, in the sudden stillness of the fur under her hand, and she looked up at Thomas, and her face crumpled, and she said his name once, very softly. Thomas said, in a voice so calm it surprised even him, it's all right, sweetheart." He waited. He waited for the bench. He waited to see her home. He bent forward. He kissed the top of Cooper's warm head. He whispered, in a voice only the dog could have heard, good boy, you can rest now. She is home. You brought her home." The crowd understood slowly in ripples, the way understanding spreads through people who are standing close. Nobody cried out. Nobody said anything loud. They only stood quiet and lowered their heads one by one in the sunlight. Frank the baker took off his hat and held it against his chest. Sarah put both her hands over her mouth and closed her eyes. Emma laid her forehead against Cooper's shoulder and did not lift it for a long time. And then, slowly, from the back of the crowd, an old woman with a cane began to sing. She did not sing loudly. She sang the way people sing at the end of a very long church service, when the songs are the ones everyone already knows. She sang a hymn about being carried home. A few other people joined her, hesitantly at first, and then more, and then the whole small crowd on the corner of Maple and 2nd in Millbrook, Ohio, on the first sunny Saturday of November, was singing softly for an old dog who had kept a promise for 7 years and had held on for 1 extra day so he could see his job through. Thomas sat on the bench with his hand on Cooper's warm body, and he listened, and he let the sunlight fall on his face. And he was not blind in that moment. He was not blind at all. He could see, with a kind of seeing that had nothing to do with eyes, the picture of the two of them, an old man and an old dog, on a yellow curb in the rain. And behind them, standing just off the edge, a woman in a blue sweater, holding a small paper bag, smiling with the corners of her mouth turned up the way she had always smiled at him. Nora was home. Cooper was home. And Thomas, sitting on a wooden bench with a brass plaque that read simply, "For those who wait," was home for the first time in 7 years. They buried Cooper the following Tuesday in a small green cemetery for pets outside town under a young oak tree. Sarah paid for the plot without being asked and without telling anyone. Frank the baker built the small wooden marker himself and burned Cooper's name into it with a soldering iron in the back room of the bakery and set it in the ground with his own hands. Emma wrote the 2nd article. It ran on the front page of the Millbrook Sentinel the following Sunday, and it was picked up by every major paper in the country, and then in Canada, and then in England. Thomas received 411 letters in the mail over the course of the next month. He did not read all of them. He read the ones Emma read to him. He kept every single one in a small cardboard box under the kitchen table where Cooper used to sleep. On a cold, clear morning 3 weeks later, Thomas walked down to the corner of Maple and 2nd by himself for the first time. He used his cane. He walked slowly. He counted his steps because he had counted them with Cooper for so many years that it felt strange not to. When he reached the yellow curb, he stopped. He sat down on the wooden bench. He took 3 long breaths. He waited. He was not waiting for a car to pass. He was not waiting for anything he could name. He was waiting because Cooper had waited, and because Nora had waited, and because he had learned, at 71 years old, that waiting was not a wasted thing. Waiting was a form of love. Waiting was how you carried the people you had lost, and how you carried the promises you had made, and how you let the world know that some things mattered enough to stand still for. After his 3 breaths, he did not stand up. He stayed on the bench. He tipped his face to the winter sun. He put his hand on the small silver ring that hung now on a fine chain around his neck, under his shirt, warm against his chest. A young woman came around the corner walking a small brown puppy that was tripping over its own paws. She saw the old man on the bench, and she saw the brass plaque, and she paused. She had read the article. Everyone had read the article. She said quietly, "May I sit with you a moment, sir?" Thomas smiled. He patted the bench beside him. He said, "Please, there is always room. That is what it is for." She sat. The puppy climbed onto Thomas's lap and licked his chin, and Thomas laughed, a small, warm, surprised laugh, and he put his hand on the puppy's soft head and remembered the day Nora had come home with a fat, sleepy golden puppy in a cardboard box 40 years ago, and had set him on the kitchen floor and had said, "This is Cooper. He is going to grow up smart. You'll see." He had, Thomas thought. He had grown up smart. The young woman told him her name. It was Lily. She was 22. She was studying to be a veterinarian at the university 2 hours away, and she had come home for the weekend to visit her grandmother, who lived on Elm Street, 3 houses down from Thomas. She said her grandmother had told her that morning that she had to walk down to the corner of Maple and 2nd and sit on the bench for a while, and that Lily would understand when she got there. Lily said softly, "I understand now." Thomas asked her the puppy's name. She said, "His name is Scout." Thomas said, "That is a good name. A dog with a name like Scout will look out for you." Lily said quietly, "That is what my grandmother said." They sat for a while in the winter sun without saying anything more. After some time, Lily stood up. She held Scout in her arms. She said, "Mr. Bennett, thank you. For the bench, for Cooper, for all of it." Thomas said, "It was not me. It was a dog, and a woman who is not here anymore, and another woman who was brave enough to come to my door." Lily said, "Then thank all of them, sir, please." Thomas said, "I do, every morning." Lily walked away with Scout in her arms. The puppy watched Thomas over her shoulder until they turned the corner. Thomas sat on the bench for a while longer. He thought about the crack in the concrete under the streetlight, where a silver ring had rested for 7 years, and where a dog had come every single morning to make sure it was still there. He thought about Sarah, who had gone back to therapy the week after the bench was set, and who called Thomas every Sunday afternoon now to check in, and who had begun to sleep whole nights again in slow, careful pieces. He thought about Emma, who had turned down the job in Columbus and stayed at the Millbrook Sentinel, and had a second column now called "For Those Who Wait," in which she told small, quiet stories about people in the town who were loving each other well. He thought about Frank the baker, who had put a small framed photograph of Cooper on the wall behind the counter and who gave a free roll to anyone who came in on the anniversary of Cooper's passing and told him the name of a dog they had loved. He thought about the plaque. He thought about the words. He thought about how, when he had first heard them from Sarah's mouth, he had known that they were exactly right, but that he had not known then all the things they would come to mean. For those who wait, for a wife walking home from the vet who had never made it across the street, for a dog who had sat down at a yellow curb for 7 years because a ring was in the concrete and a person was in his heart, and both of them needed him to stand watch, for a young woman in a truck who had carried a paper bag for 7 years because she did not know how else to carry the weight, for a reporter who had walked past the same bakery for months before she stopped and asked and listened, for a baker who had held out his flour-dusted arms without being asked, for a whole town that had learned, in one small November morning, that grief is not something you get over but something you get through, and that you get through it faster when someone sits down beside you on a bench in the sun. For those who wait. Thomas got up slowly and put on his hat and picked up his cane. He said softly to the empty bench beside him, "I will see you tomorrow, buddy. I will see you both tomorrow." He turned. He walked home, slowly, alone, along the sidewalk he had walked with Cooper for 15 years. He did not need Cooper to guide him. He knew the way by heart. At the door of his little blue house, he stopped. He put his hand on the door frame. He said out loud to nobody and to everybody, "Thank you." Then he opened the door and he stepped inside, and he took off his hat, and he set it on the hook, and the small, warm, quiet house wrapped itself around him like a familiar coat. On the shelf beside the door, in a small ceramic dish that had once held a silver ring, there was now a folded piece of paper. On the paper, in his own careful handwriting, Thomas had written the words, "The plaque said," so that on the days when he forgot, he could touch it with his fingers and remember. He touched it now. He said the words to himself, in his own voice, low and steady, "For those who wait." Then he walked into the kitchen and put the kettle on, and while the water heated, he stood by the window in the last of the afternoon light, with one hand on the ring at his chest, and he did what he had learned to do best in a life that had taken from him and given back to him in ways he had never expected. He waited, and he listened, and he loved. And somewhere on a corner of Maple and Second in a small Ohio town, a wooden bench sat warm in the sun with a brass plaque that told strangers a small, quiet thing. And one by one, as the days went by, people came and sat and understood. If this story moved you, take a moment to leave a comment about someone you have loved and waited for. Hit the like button so it can find other people who need it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story that stays with you long after the video ends. Because in the end, all any of us really are in this brief and beautiful life are people who wait for the ones we love and dogs who never forget the way home.